Daniel Hayes stood in the middle of the giant chamber and felt very small in a way he had never felt before back on Earth, where everything was built for humans and made sense to human eyes. But here in the Galactic Council building, nothing was made for humans, and everything reminded him that his species was new and weak and unwanted in a galaxy that had been civilized for millions of years before humans even existed. The walls of the chamber were made of some kind of crystal that changed colors when the different alien species moved or spoke, and Daniel could see hundreds of different life forms sitting in curved rows that went up and up until they disappeared into shadows far above his head, and every single one of those aliens was looking down at him with what he could only guess was amusement or contempt or both. Claire Morrison stood next to Daniel, and he could feel her tension, even though she tried to hide it behind her calm professional mask. But they had worked together for 3 years now, and he knew when she was angry or scared, and right now, she was both, because they had come here with hope, and Earth had sent them with instructions to secure membership in the Council, no matter what it took. But Daniel was starting to realize that Earth had sent them on an impossible mission. The voice that spoke next came from a being that looked like it had been carved from living rock with 6 arms, that moved in ways that made Daniel dizzy to watch. And the translation device in his ear told him this was Counselor Veshitar, who was one of the oldest and most powerful members of the Council, and also one of the beings who had been most vocal about rejecting humanity's application. Veshitar spoke, and his words came through the translator with a tone that Daniel's device marked as deeply amused, like someone laughing at a joke that only they understood, and the words themselves were simple enough, but they cut deep into Daniel's pride and into his hope for his species. Your species wants to join the Council, but what do you offer that we do not already have asked? Veshitar and his 6 arms spread wide in a gesture that seemed to encompass the entire chamber and all the powerful species within it. You are fragile, and you break from simple falls that would not even bruise our children. Continued Veshitar, and several other aliens made sounds that the translator marked as laughter, and Daniel felt his face grow hot with shame and anger. You live for barely a century, which is less time than it takes most of our species to finish their basic education, said Veshitar. And more laughter echoed through the chamber, and Daniel wanted to shout at them that humans had achieved more in 200 years of spaceflight than some species achieved in 10,000 years. But he kept his mouth shut because losing his temper would only prove their point about humans being emotional and unstable. Claire stepped forward, and her tablet projected images into the air showing human technology and human achievements and human cities on a dozen different worlds. But before she could speak, another voice interrupted her, and this voice belonged to a creature that looked like a giant snake with scales that shimmered in colors Daniel had no names for. The translator identified this being as Counselor Thane, and his voice carried even more contempt than Veshitar's had, and he spoke about how humans had not even invented faster than light travel on their own, but had only managed to copy it from a probe that had crashed on Earth decades ago. You reversed engineered our technology, said Thane, and his body coiled in what might have been the equivalent of a dismissive shrug. And you call this achievement, but a child who copies another child's homework has not learned anything. Daniel felt Claire tense beside him, and he put a hand on her arm to stop her from saying something that would make things worse, and he took a breath and tried to think of the right words to say, but everything he thought of sounded weak or desperate or both. We improved your designs by 17%, said Claire, and her voice was steady, but Daniel could hear the strain beneath it, and she pulled up new images showing the modifications humans had made to the alien, faster than light drive. Efficiency, said Veshitar, and he made a sound that the translator could not interpret, but which Daniel understood as mocking laughter. And what does efficiency matter when your bodies are so weak that one of our worker drones could kill 100 of your soldiers? Your bones break from impacts that would not even bruise a Krell child, said another voice from somewhere in the shadows above, and Daniel looked up to see enormous beings made of what looked like living stone, and these must be the Krell that Veshitar had mentioned. You need constant temperature regulation or you die, said another voice, and this one belonged to a floating jellyfish-like creature that glowed with its own light. And you need to eat multiple times per day, or you grow weak and you cannot survive in vacuum for even seconds. We are resilient in other ways, said Daniel. And he hated how weak his voice sounded in the vast chamber, but he pushed forward anyway, because he had to try, because Earth was counting on him. We adapt quickly, and we solve problems in creative ways. And we have a will to survive that has carried us through ice ages and plagues and wars and extinction events on our own world, said Daniel. And he tried to put strength into his words, but even as he spoke them, he could see that the council members were not impressed. Veshtar made another gesture with his 6 arms, and the crystal walls seemed to pulse with light, and Daniel knew what was coming before the words were even spoken. Pretty words, said Veshtar, but the galaxy is not kind to fragile things, and we have seen 1,000 species rise and fall, and those that survived were strong, and those that died were weak, and your species is weak. Your application is denied, said Thane, and his serpentine body uncoiled as if the matter was already finished. And when your species evolves into something stronger, perhaps in another 1,000,000 years you may apply again. A sound rang through the chamber, like a bell made of starlight, and Daniel knew this was the signal that the session was over, and the decision was final, and there would be no appeal, and no second chance, and Earth would remain alone and unprotected in a galaxy full of species that saw humans as nothing more than fragile prey. Claire touched his arm, and Daniel turned to follow her out of the chamber, and as they walked through the corridors toward their ship, he could still hear the echoes of alien laughter following them like ghosts. The corridors were empty because the council had moved on to other business and more important matters than the rejected application of a weak species, and Daniel felt the weight of failure pressing down on him like a physical thing. They reached their ship, which was called Earth's Hope, though Daniel thought that name seemed cruelly ironic now. And as they climbed aboard, Claire finally spoke, and her voice was tight with controlled fury. "What do we tell them?" she asked, and Daniel knew she meant everyone back on Earth, all the billions of people who were counting on the Council's protection and resources. Daniel looked out through the view screen at the massive station orbiting the neutral moon, and he could see hundreds of alien ships docked there, representing civilizations that had outlasted empires and conquered stars and built wonders that humans could barely imagine. "We tell them the truth," said Daniel, and his voice was hollow and tired, "and we tell them that the Council thinks we are too weak to matter." "Are we?" asked Claire, and there was something dangerous in her voice that made Daniel look at her sharply, and he saw in her eyes the same thing he was feeling, which was not defeat, but rather a growing anger that came from being dismissed and mocked and treated like nothing. "No," said Daniel, and he felt certainty settle into his bones like iron. "And we are not weak, and maybe it is time we proved it." Neither of them knew as their ship turned away from the station and began the long journey back to Earth that within 5 years the galaxy would learn exactly what humanity could do when cornered and underestimated, and left with nothing to lose, and no reason to hold back. The blue dot of Earth grew larger in their view screen, and Daniel made a silent promise to his species that they would never again ask permission to exist. Amy Rodriguez was drinking coffee in her captain's chair when the distress call came through, and the coffee went cold in her hand as she listened to the terror in the colonist's voice and the sounds of weapons fire and screaming in the background. The message was breaking up because of distance or interference or both, but the words that came through were enough to make Amy's blood run cold, and she heard someone saying they were under attack and people were being taken, and "Please, someone, help us," before the transmission cut to nothing but static. "All hands to battle station," said Amy, and her voice cut through the quiet bridge like a knife and navigation plot. "A course to New Terra, maximum burn and communications. Send word to Earth Defense Fleet that we have a situation." The crew moved with practiced efficiency, but Amy could see the tension in their shoulders and the tightness around their eyes because everyone on the Liberty knew that New Terra was 3 days away, even at maximum burn, and 3 days was a long time when people were dying. Peter Chang looked up from his console, and his face was grim as he pulled up the tactical display, showing their position and the colony's position and the impossible distance between them. "Captain," said Peter, and his voice was carefully neutral, in the way that officers used when they wanted to say something without actually saying it, "and by the time we reach New Terra, it might be too late to help." Amy knew what he meant without him having to spell it out, which was that they might arrive to find everyone dead or taken or worse. But she also knew that not going was not an option, because those were human beings on New Terra, and the Liberty was the only ship close enough to respond. "I know," said Amy, "but we are going anyway," and she saw Peter nod once and turn back to his console, and she knew that he understood because he was a good officer, and he knew that sometimes you had to try even when the odds were impossible. The Liberty accelerated toward New Terra, and Amy spent the next 3 days preparing her crew for what they might find and trying not to think about the 3,000 colonists who had made New Terra their home. When they finally arrived at New Terra, what Amy saw through the viewscreen made her stomach turn and her hands clench into fists because the colony was destroyed in a way that spoke of deliberate cruelty rather than simple military action. The buildings had been torn apart but not completely destroyed, and Amy realized with growing horror that this was not an attack meant to kill, but rather an attack meant to harvest, and someone had come to New Terra to take things, and those things included people. Kevin Barnes spoke from the tactical station, and his voice was shaking slightly as he reported that they were picking up 6 ships on sensors, and they were big, and they were definitely not human, and they were still in orbit around New Terra. 2 of them are heavy cruisers, said Kevin, and Amy heard the unspoken message, which was that the Liberty was just a frigate with 43 crew members, and they were outnumbered and outgunned by an enemy that had casually destroyed a colony of 3,000 people. They are hailing us, said Kevin, and Amy straightened in her chair and told him to put it through, and she prepared herself to face whoever had done this terrible thing. The face that appeared on the screen was insectoid with compound eyes that reflected light in strange ways and mandibles that clicked together as the creature spoke through a translation device. Human vessel, said the insect, and its voice was flat and emotionless, in a way that made it somehow worse than if it had been angry or cruel. And you will leave this system immediately, as these subjects have been claimed under salvage rights. Amy felt rage building in her chest like a fire that wanted to burn everything, and she forced herself to speak calmly, even though what she wanted to do was scream. Those are human beings, said Amy, and she put all the steel she could into her voice, and you will release them immediately or face consequences. The insect's mandibles spread wide in what might have been laughter, and Amy realized these were Genva, which was a species known for taking slaves from unprotected worlds. Consequences, said the Genva commander, and his tone made clear how little he feared a single human frigate. And from one small human ship, your species was rejected by the council because you are weak and fragile, and you should thank us for giving your people purpose in our labor camps. Amy looked at Peter and then at the rest of her crew, and she saw the same expression on every face, which was cold fury mixed with determination, and she knew they were all thinking the same thing. Tactical, said Amy, and her voice was very quiet. Now and very calm, and target their cargo ships and load everything we have. Peter stood up from his station, and his face was pale, but his voice was steady, as he reminded her that they could not win this fight, and they needed to fall back and get reinforcements. Those are our people on those ships, said Amy, and she cut him off before he could say more and load weapons now. What happened next would be talked about for generations, and studied in military academies across human space, as either the bravest or the most foolish action in naval history, depending on who you asked. The Liberty charged directly into the Genva, fleet like a small dog attacking a pack of wolves, and by every tactical calculation and every military doctrine it was suicide. But Amy had read something once about how it was not the size of the dog in the fight, but the size of the fight in the dog. The Liberty's weapons tore into the first cargo ship's engines, and the explosions lit up the darkness of space, and Amy saw escape pods launching from the cargo ship, which meant the colonists were escaping, and that was good. But now the Genva cruisers were turning their weapons toward the Liberty. Evasive maneuvers, said Amy, and the ship twisted and dove in patterns that made the artificial gravity struggle to compensate, and the Genva weapons fire missed by meters and then by centimeters as Amy pushed her ship and her crew to their absolute limits. She piloted the Liberty into the gap between the 2 heavy cruisers and forced them into a position where they could not fire without risking hitting each other, and this bought her crew precious seconds to damage the second cargo ship. The Genva were not stupid, though, and they quickly adjusted their formation, and Amy knew she had only moments before they would be in a position to destroy the Liberty without any risk to themselves. All power to forward shield, said Amy, and her hands moved across the controls with practiced ease and ramming speed, and she heard gasps from her crew, but no one questioned the order. Peter looked at her and his eyes were wide, but he nodded once, and then he turned to the communication station and started recording a message. All hands brace for impact, said Amy, and her voice was steady even though her heart was pounding. and someone send a message back to Earth and tell them we did not go quietly. The Liberty accelerated toward the Genva flagship, and Amy could see the enemy commander's face on the screen, and she saw the moment when he realized what she was about to do. And she saw fear replace contempt in his compound eyes. "For Earth," said Amy, and she thought about her family back home and her friends and all the people who would never know her name, but who would be safer because of what she was about to do. The Liberty struck the Genva flagship at 60%. Light speed, and the universe became light and heat, and then nothing. The explosion destroyed both ships instantly and damaged the second cruiser badly enough that it limped away, trailing debris and atmosphere, and the remaining Genva ships scattered in panic because they had never encountered an enemy that would deliberately destroy themselves to win. Human reinforcements arrived 6 hours later and found the cargo ships floating dead in space with 3,000 colonists alive in the holds and the wreckage of the Liberty scattered across 1,000 kilometers. There were no survivors from the Liberty's crew, and each of the 43 names was engraved on a memorial that was built facing the stars, and beneath those names, someone carved a single line. "We are fragile, yes, but we burn bright." Helen Foster stood deep underground in a bunker that had been built to survive nuclear war, and looked at the holographic map showing every human colony scattered across space like seeds thrown into an ocean, and each glowing point represented thousands of lives that were now in danger. Because the galaxy had decided humans were easy prey, the attack on New Terra had changed everything, and not in the way the Genva had intended, because instead of making humans afraid, it had made them angry in a cold, calculated way that was far more dangerous than any hot rage could ever be. "They think we are weak," said Helen to the assembled military and scientific leaders who had gathered in the bunker, "and they think our fragility makes us victims, but we are going to prove them wrong." Marcus Webb stepped forward, and he was the head of the Advanced Weapons Division, and he had been working on something secret for the past 8 months, and now he was ready to share it with the people who would decide humanity's future. "Director, I need to show you something," said Marcus, and the holographic map shifted to display schematics that made even the hardened military officers lean forward with interest. "We have been thinking about our vulnerability the wrong way," said Marcus, and he gestured at the complex designs floating in the air. "And yes, we are fragile compared to most species, and we cannot survive in vacuum, and we need temperature regulation, and we die easily. But there is one thing we do better than any species we have encountered." "What is that?" asked Admiral Lisa Morgan, and her voice carried the weight of someone who had lost too many people under her command and was desperate for anything that might even the odds. "We burn," said Marcus, and he said it simply, like he was stating an obvious fact, and humans discovered fire before we discovered the wheel, and we have been harnessing combustion and oxidation and energy release for hundreds of thousands of years. He pulled up new schematics that showed an engine design unlike anything the galaxy had seen before, and it was crude and violent, and produced massive amounts of thermal energy. "This is the Prometheus engine," said Marcus, "and it does not use the fancy gravitic drives the other species prefer, and it is basically a controlled explosion that never stops, and we can make it do things the other species never imagined possible." Lisa studied the designs, and her eyes moved over the numbers and calculations, and she was starting to smile in a way that would have terrified anyone who knew her well. "How hot are we talking?" asked Lisa, and Marcus's grin matched hers. "Hot enough to turn their supposedly indestructible hulls into vapor," said Marcus, and the Krell delegates mocked us because their stone-like bodies can survive in hard vacuum. But they have never experienced temperatures approaching a star's core, because nobody uses that kind of heat, since it is inefficient and wasteful and dangerous, which is exactly why they will never see it coming, said Helen. And she looked around at the others and saw understanding dawning on their faces. Over the next 18 months, humanity transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible before. New Terra, and every resource and every innovation and every ounce of creativity was poured into a single goal, which was to ensure that humanity would never again be easy prey. The Prometheus engines were just the beginning, and human engineers who were freed from the constraints of trying to copy alien technology began developing weapons that terrified even their own creators. They built missiles that used chemical propulsion to reach speeds that made alien sensors scream warnings, and they built beam weapons powered by fusion reactions that had no business being weaponized, and most terrifying of all, they created the Hellfire Protocol, Ryan Foster looked at the specifications for the Hellfire drones and his face was pale, as he read about how these autonomous weapons would deliberately overheat their cores and dive into enemy ships, turning themselves into miniature suns. "This is insane," said Ryan, and he looked at the other officers around him, "and these drones will burn themselves up after a single use." Nina Reeves had just been given command of a new ship called the Defiance, and she looked at the Hellfire specs with a different perspective than Ryan. "Yes," said Nina, "but they will take enemy capital ships with them, and we are not trying to match the other species in longevity or durability because we cannot, and we are accepting our mortality and weaponizing it instead." It was a philosophy that would have seemed crazy to the long-lived species of the galaxy, who measured their lives in centuries or millennia, and to them any weapon that consumed itself was wasteful. But humans who lived fast and died young understood something that the ancient species had forgotten. Sometimes to protect what you love, you have to be willing to burn. The first test of the Prometheus engine came when Genva raiders attacked a colony called New Hope, and they sent 3 heavy cruisers, which should have been more than enough to overwhelm the colony's defenses. But humanity was different now. The Defiance emerged from faster-than-light travel with its Prometheus engines burning at 92% capacity, and the thermal signature alone made the Genva sensors scream warnings that something was wrong. Nina sat in her captain's chair and watched the enemy ships on her display, and she felt a cold satisfaction knowing that these raiders had no idea what was about to happen to them. "Fire," said Nina, and the word was simple, but it unleashed something that had never existed in galactic warfare before. The Defiance's main cannons released focused streams of plasma at temperatures that existed nowhere in nature, except in the hearts of dying stars, and the energy was so intense that space itself seemed to ripple. The first Genva cruiser's shields were designed to deflect particle beams and absorb kinetic impacts, but they had never been built to handle this kind of thermal energy, and they collapsed in seconds like paper in a furnace. The hull beneath the shields was made of a ceramic metallic composite that could survive re-entry on gas giants, but it began to glow and then melt, and then vaporize as the plasma cut through it like butter. The other 2 cruisers did not stay to fight, and they retreated immediately while broadcasting warnings across all Genva channels that humans were no longer easy targets, and that something had changed in a fundamental way. Back on Earth in the command center, Helen watched the battle feed with Marcus standing beside her, and they both felt the weight of what they had unleashed. "Send a message to the Galactic Council," said Helen, "and tell them humanity would like to renegotiate our application for membership." Marcus looked at her with a question in his eyes, and Helen knew what he was asking without him having to speak. "And if they refuse again?" asked Marcus. "Then we will show them what fragile species can do when they stop asking for permission," said Helen, and her voice was cold and hard and carried the promise of fire. Word spread across the galaxy faster than light travel could carry it, and species that had barely noticed humanity's existence were suddenly paying very close attention to the fragile newcomers who had weaponized their own mortality. The Council received reports from a dozen different sources, and all of them told the same story, which was that humans had developed something new and dangerous and completely outside the normal patterns of galactic warfare. In bars and trading, posts across civilized space people who had never heard of Earth were suddenly talking about the species that turned their ships into bombs and their weakness into weapons. Some species laughed and said humans were crazy and would destroy themselves before they became a real threat. But others who were wiser looked at the reports and felt fear, because they understood something important. A species with nothing to lose and everything to prove was the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, and humanity had just announced to everyone that they were done being victims. Nina stood on the bridge of the Defiance and looked out at the stars and thought about Amy Rodriguez and the Liberty, and all the others who had died because the galaxy thought humans were weak. "We are not weak," said Nina quietly to herself, "and we burn." The Galactic Council chamber was quieter than it had been in centuries, and Councillor Veshtar sat in his elevated seat, reviewing tactical data that should not have been possible, but which had been verified by 3 independent sources, and all of them told the same impossible story. The humans had developed weapons that generated core temperatures exceeding 15 million degrees, which was hot enough to initiate fusion reactions, and which was insane because no species would deliberately design weapons that wasteful and that dangerous and that unpredictable. "This cannot be accurate," said Veshitar, and his 6 arms moved in patterns that expressed deep unease, and no species would build something like this. Thorak was a Krell military advisor, and he was made of living stone, and he had survived battles that would have destroyed lesser beings, but even he looked disturbed as he gestured to the holographic replay of the engagement at New Hope. "The data is verified." Counselor said Thorak and the human vessel generated temperatures that we have only ever measured inside stars, and their weapons simply vaporized our armor, which was supposed to be indestructible. "But the energy expenditure," protested Veshitar, and he was grasping for some rational explanation, and the inefficiency alone should make these weapons impractical. Counselor Thane uncoiled from his position, and his serpentine body moved in ways that expressed what his species considered deep concern. "They do not care about efficiency," said Thane, "and that is what we failed to understand about them, because they have short lifespans and fragile bodies, and now they have built weapons that mirror those qualities, which are brief and destructive and utterly without restraint." The council chamber fell into a silence that was heavy with implications, because for thousands of years galactic warfare had been a calculated affair of attrition and shields and armor and battles that could last for months or years as fleets slowly wore each other down. But humanity had changed the rules by deciding that if they could not outlast their enemies, then they would simply burn hot enough that their enemies could not withstand them. "We need to contain this," said Veshtar finally, and before their weapons spread to other aggressive species, because if the Genva or the Krell or any of the warlike races get access to this technology. He did not finish the sentence because everyone in the chamber understood what he meant, which was that the careful balance of power that had kept the galaxy relatively peaceful for millennia would collapse overnight. But it was already too late for containment. The Genva Empire was not willing to accept their defeats, and their pride demanded that they respond with overwhelming force, and so they assembled an invasion fleet that was unprecedented in size and scope, 20 capital ships and 100 cruisers and countless support vessels, all aimed at one target, which was Earth itself, because if humanity wanted to play with fire, then the Genva would show them what it meant to be burned. Admiral Lisa Morgan received the intelligence report 48 hours before the Genva fleet would reach the outer solar system, and she stood on the bridge of her ship, the Fury, which was humanity's first purpose-built warship designed from the ground up around the Prometheus engine. "They are bringing everything they have said," Jake Sullivan, who was her tactical officer, "and our models suggest they are prepared for our new weapons, because they have reinforced their shields and added ablative armor, and distributed their formations to minimize thermal weapon effectiveness." "Good," said Lisa, and her response surprised everyone on the bridge, "and they are adapting to what they have seen, which means they are not ready for what they have not seen." She pulled up a file that was marked with the highest security classification, and even crew members with top-level clearance had never heard of Project Supernova before that moment. Jake read the specifications and his face went pale, and he looked at Lisa with something between horror and awe. "Director Foster authorized this?" asked Jake quietly. "She did," said Lisa, "and the question is, are we ready to use it?" The crew exchanged glances, and they knew what was being asked, because Project Supernova was not just a weapon, but a statement, and a line in the sand, and a demonstration that humanity would go to any length to protect its own. "The volunteer fleet is ready," said Jake, and his voice was rough with emotion, "and 18 ships crewed entirely by volunteers who know they will not be coming back. Each vessel had been equipped with a modified Prometheus engine that had been deliberately destabilized, so that instead of producing controlled fusion, it would produce an uncontrolled reaction, which was essentially a miniature nova contained in a ship-sized package. "They mocked us for being fragile," said Lisa softly, and she was looking out at the stars that would soon become a battlefield, "and they laughed because we die easily, but they never asked themselves why a species that dies so easily would be so fearless." She paused and then continued, "And it is because we have always known our time is short, and we have always known that what matters is not how long you live, but what you do with the time you have." The Genva fleet entered the solar system expecting to find Earth's defenders scattered and afraid, but instead they found a human fleet waiting in formation, and the Genva commanders were confident because they outnumbered the humans 10 to 1. They had adapted their tactics based on previous encounters, and they had reinforced their defenses against thermal weapons, and they were certain that this time they would crush humanity once and for all. What they had not prepared for was humanity's willingness to turn their own ships into weapons. The 18 volunteer ships of what would forever be known as the Suicide Squadron accelerated toward the Genva fleet, and their Prometheus engines were building toward critical mass, and every single crew member on those ships knew exactly what they were doing and why. The Genva fleet opened fire, and they destroyed 3 of the volunteer ships before they could reach their targets, but the remaining 15 kept coming, and nothing could stop them. Andrew Martinez was the captain of the Vengeance, and his last transmission was recorded and saved and would be played at memorials for generations, and his words were simple. "For humanity," said Andrew, "and for Earth, and for all the ones who cannot fight back." Then the Vengeance detonated. The explosion was visible from Earth with the naked eye, and it burned like a new star for 43 seconds before it faded, and when the light cleared, 7 Genva capital ships had simply ceased to exist, and their flagship was crippled beyond any hope of repair. The other 14 volunteer ships followed in sequence, and each crew chose their target with precision, and each person made their peace in their final moments, and by the time the last ship, which was called the Hope, detonated in the heart of the Genva fleet, the invasion force had been reduced to scattered remnants fleeing back toward their own territory. Lisa watched from the fury as the enemy retreated, and around her the bridge crew was silent, because they were mourning 340 souls who had just given everything for their species' survival. "Send a message to the Galactic Council," said Lisa, and her voice was rough with emotion, "and tell them this." She paused to collect herself and then continued. "And we asked nicely for membership, and we asked to be treated as equals, and you laughed at our fragility, and at our weakness, and at our short lives. But we are still here, and we will always be here, because fragile things that refuse to break are the strongest things in the universe." She took a breath and finished, "And tell them if anyone else decides humanity is easy prey, we have plenty more fire to share." The message was sent, and it reached every corner of civilized space within days, and the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. 6 months after the Battle of Earth, as it came to be known, Daniel Hayes stood once again in the Galactic Council chamber. But this time, everything was different in ways both subtle and profound. The laughter was gone, and the mockery had been replaced by something that Daniel had never expected to see in alien eyes, which was fear mixed with a careful, grudging respect that came from beings who had suddenly realized that the weak species they had dismissed was capable of burning their civilizations to ash. "Ambassador Hayes," said Counselor Veshtar, and his 6 arms were folded in a posture that human xenopsychologists had learned meant deep discomfort, "and the Council has reviewed your renewed application for membership. Have you asked Daniel and—" His tone was mild, but there was steel underneath it, because he remembered standing in this same chamber, being mocked and dismissed and told that humanity was too fragile to matter. Behind him, Claire Morrison stood with her data tablet, but this time, she was not displaying technological specifications or trade proposals, but rather military readiness reports that showed exactly how many ships humanity could field and how hot their weapons could burn. "We have concerns," said Counselor Thane and his serpentine body, weaved in patterns of agitation, "and your species' new weapons represent a destabilizing force in galactic affairs, because the thermal yields you have achieved are well within the Council's own weapons limitations," said Claire, and she interrupted smoothly, "and we have reviewed the regulations, and nothing we have developed violates any existing treaties. Because no one thought any species would be insane enough to build weapons that consume themselves," muttered a counselor from somewhere in the shadows, and Daniel could hear the fear in that voice. Daniel stepped forward, and several counselors actually moved back, which would have been funny if the situation had not been so serious. "You mistook our fragility for weakness," said Daniel, and his voice carried through the chamber. "And you assumed that because our lives are short and our bodies breakable, we would be timid, but you forgot something important." He paused and looked around at the assembled aliens and continued, "And we are the species that looked at fire and decided to tame it. And we are the species that split the atom, knowing it could destroy us. And we are the species that went to space in controlled explosions, because we were willing to die to reach the stars. We do not want war," said Daniel, "and never did, and we asked to join your council peacefully, and we offered trade and cooperation and knowledge sharing, and you responded with mockery. And when the Genva thought they could prey on us, you did nothing. said Claire, and her voice was harder than Daniel's. The colonies were outside council jurisdiction, protested Veshtar, but his voice was weak. Convenient, said Daniel coldly, but that is fine, because we have learned an important lesson, which is that in this galaxy, you either have a seat at the table, or you are on the menu. So here is our new proposal, said Daniel, and he pulled up a hologram that showed the Prometheus engine in detail. And humanity will join the Galactic Council with full voting rights and all privileges, and in exchange we will share our Prometheus engine technology with council members for peaceful applications only. The chamber erupted in shocked noise, and conversations in a dozen different languages overlapped as counselors tried to understand what they had just heard. Counselor Thane was the first to regain his composure, and his voice was careful as he asked the question that everyone was thinking. You would share your weapons technology, he asked, and why would you do that? Not weapons technology, said Claire, and she corrected him firmly, and the engines themselves, because properly controlled, they are the most efficient power generation system in known space, and you could revolutionize your infrastructure and your industries and your civilian ship propulsion. We are offering you the keys to a new age of prosperity, said Daniel, and his tone made clear that this was not a request but rather a statement of terms. And if we refuse your membership again? Asked Veshitar, and his voice trembled slightly. Daniel's expression became hard and cold, and he let the silence stretch for a moment before answering. Then we will continue to defend ourselves using those same engines, said Daniel, and every species that thinks humanity is easy prey will learn the same lesson the Genva did, and eventually you will be forced to deal with a galaxy where humanity either stands as your ally or burns as your enemy. The choice is yours, said Claire, and she closed her tablet with a decisive snap. It was a bluff, but only barely, because Earth's industrial capacity was already stretched to breaking maintaining the new fleet. But the Council did not know that, and what they did know was that humanity had demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice everything for survival. The vote took 3 days, and during that time Daniel and Claire waited in their ship and tried not to think about what would happen if the Council rejected them again. But when the results came through, they were unanimous, and every single Council member had voted to accept humanity's membership because fear and pragmatism had finally overcome pride and prejudice. On Earth, Helen Foster stood looking up at the stars, and Marcus Webb stood beside her, and they both felt the weight of what they had accomplished and what it had cost. Do you think they will ever trust us? Asked Marcus. Helen considered the question carefully before answering, and no, I do not think they will, but that is okay, because trust is earned over time, and we have time now. Besides, said Helen, and fear and respect will do for now. Marcus was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke about something that had been weighing on his mind. The volunteer crews, he said, and the ones who flew the suicide squadron, and they will never know that their sacrifice changed everything. Yes, they will, said Helen, and her voice was fierce, and because we will make sure their names are remembered, and every ship we build and every station we establish and every world we settle will tell the story of the fragile species that refused to stay down. She turned to face Marcus and continued, and we will tell the story of Andrew Martinez in the Vengeance, and of Amy Rodriguez in the Liberty, and of all the humans who proved that we burn bright. In the years that followed, humanity became one of the most influential species in the Council, not because they lived the longest or had the strongest bodies or the most advanced original technology, but because they had proven something that the galaxy had forgotten. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the universe is not the strongest predator, or the oldest civilization, or the most advanced technology, but rather a species that has nothing to lose and everything to prove. The Treaty of Earth, as it came to be known, established new protocols for protecting developing species from exploitation, and the Genva Empire was sanctioned and forced to release all enslaved populations. At humanity's insistence, a memorial was erected at Council headquarters, and it was a flame that would burn for eternity, powered by a small Prometheus engine, in honor of all the lives lost defending the right to exist. Beneath the eternal flame was an inscription in 100 languages, and they all said the same thing. They laughed at our fragility, and they mocked our weakness, and they forgot that even the smallest flame, if it burns bright enough, can ignite the stars. Daniel visited that memorial whenever he attended council sessions, and every time he would pause and remember that humanity had earned its place not by becoming something else, but by embracing exactly what they were, fragile and mortal and brief, and absolutely unstoppable when they decided to burn.